"There is someone walking out there," Emma Hayes whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the roar of the storm. The words sounded impossible even to her own ears. Rain hammered the metal roof above her with relentless force. Wind pushed against the walls of the emergency shelter hard enough to make the entire structure groan. Outside, darkness swallowed everything beyond a few feet of visibility. The mountains had disappeared behind sheets of rain hours ago. No rescue team would be moving through conditions like these. No hikers. No travelers. No one. Yet Emma sat upright on the narrow cot, every muscle tense, staring toward the closed door as if she could see through it. Another sound reached her. Faint, rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. Her breathing slowed. She listened again. The storm tried to bury every noise beneath its endless roar, but the sound was still there. One step, then another, then silence. Emma pressed a hand against her side where the injury still throbbed beneath a bandage. Pain shot through her ribs when she shifted position, but she ignored it. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She carefully swung her legs over the side of the cot and limped toward the small window beside the door. Rain streaked across the glass. Beyond it was nothing but darkness and chaos. Wind-driven water raced sideways through the air. Trees bent under powerful gusts. No human figure appeared anywhere. Emma frowned. Maybe exhaustion was catching up with her. The day had been long. The injury had drained her energy. She had been separated from the rest of the team for hours. Even so, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. She closed her eyes. The storm became a wall of sound around her. Most people heard noise. Emma heard layers. Deep vibrations from the wind moving through the valley. Rain striking rock. Water rushing downhill. Branches scraping against each other. Then there it was again. Different this time. A metallic click. Very faint. Almost hidden. Emma's eyes opened immediately. Her heart began to beat faster. That sound did not belong to the storm. She moved toward the communications radio, sitting on a nearby table. The signal had been weak all evening, fading in and out as weather conditions worsened. She adjusted the volume and listened to the static. Nothing. She waited. Still nothing. Another burst of wind rattled the shelter. Then a new sound slipped through the storm. A distant crackle. Not thunder. Not falling debris. It sounded almost like a radio transmission carried across miles of rough terrain. Emma stared into the darkness beyond the window. Her instincts told her she was not imagining any of this. Somewhere beyond the rain, beyond the fog, beyond the black curtain of the storm, something was moving. Someone was moving. The realization sent a chill through her. She looked at the silent radio again. Captain Daniel Brooks and the rest of the team were miles away by now. They believed she was safe until the weather improved. Emma wanted to believe that too. But as another faint sound emerged from the darkness, she found herself gripping the edge of the table. Because for the first time that night, she was no longer afraid of being alone. She was afraid that she was not alone at all. Several hours earlier, the storm had not seemed nearly as dangerous. Gray clouds had gathered over the mountain range throughout the afternoon, but Captain Daniel Brooks and his rescue team had expected little more than heavy rain. Weather conditions changed quickly in the region. Everyone knew that. What nobody expected was how rapidly the system would intensify. Emma Hayes had been moving along a narrow trail with the rest of the team when the first serious gusts struck the mountainside. Rain arrived moments later. Within minutes, visibility dropped dramatically. Communication became difficult. The world beyond 50 feet vanished behind sheets of water. Daniel immediately ordered the team to move toward a series of emergency shelters marked on their route maps. The decision came just in time. As conditions deteriorated, footing became increasingly dangerous along the rocky terrain. Emma had been helping another team member cross a slippery section of trail when she lost her balance. The fall was not dramatic, but it was enough. Pain shot through her side and leg the moment she hit the ground. Daniel reached her within seconds. At first, everyone hoped she could continue. Emma certainly tried. She pushed herself to her feet and insisted she was fine. But after several hundred yards, it became obvious she could not maintain the pace necessary to stay ahead of the worsening weather. The storm was accelerating faster than predicted. Every minute mattered. Daniel hated the choice in front of him. Leave Emma completely exposed on the trail and risk greater injury, or move her into the nearest emergency shelter and continue toward the primary extraction point before conditions became impossible. The shelter sat less than a quarter-mile away. It was stocked with emergency supplies, medical equipment, water, and communications gear. Under normal circumstances, it would have been more than sufficient for a temporary stay. "We will come back as soon as the weather breaks," Daniel told her. Emma nodded despite the disappointment in her eyes. She understood the situation. The mission required the team to keep moving. Nobody was abandoning her. At least that was what logic said. Emotion felt different. She watched them disappear into the rain one by one until the storm swallowed every trace of their movement. For a while, she focused entirely on practical tasks. She treated her injuries, checked emergency supplies, tested the radio, reviewed weather updates. The routine helped pass the time. But as darkness settled across the mountains, the isolation began to feel heavier. The storm seemed alive. Wind pushed against the structure from every direction. Rain drummed endlessly against metal walls and roofing. Shadows shifted whenever lightning flashed somewhere beyond the ridges. Emma had spent years working in difficult environments. Solitude did not usually bother her. Tonight felt different. Around midnight, she began noticing things that refused to fit. At first, it was a pattern buried beneath the weather. A sound appearing at regular intervals, then disappearing, then returning again. She told herself it was only the storm. Wind could create strange effects in mountainous terrain. Water could carry echoes in unexpected ways. Yet the sounds continued. Eventually, she stopped trying to ignore them. Emma sat quietly beside the radio and listened. Not casually, intentionally. The way a musician isolates a single instrument within an orchestra. Layers slowly separated. Rain, wind, trees, flowing water, structural vibrations. Then something else. A faint sequence of noises moving across the landscape with purpose. Her pulse quickened. She glanced toward the radio. If Daniel were here, he would probably tell her to rest, to stop worrying, to wait for daylight. But another sound drifted through the storm. This time she was certain. It was not random. It was not natural. And whatever was creating it was getting closer. Emma Hayes remained motionless beside the radio, listening so carefully that even her own breathing felt too loud. The storm continued its assault on the mountains. Rain hammered the shelter. Wind howled through the trees. Thunder rolled across distant ridges. To most people, the sounds would have blended together into a single wall of noise. Emma heard something very different. She heard separation, layers, patterns, tiny details hiding inside larger sounds. The strange noise returned a few minutes later. This time it lasted longer. Emma closed her eyes. The sound came from somewhere northwest of the shelter. Not close, not far either. She pictured the terrain map from memory. A narrow valley ran through that section of the mountain range. Dense trees, steep slopes, limited visibility even during daylight. The storm made it almost impossible to travel through safely. Yet something was moving there. She heard a faint metallic rattle. Then another. A pause followed. Then two quick sounds close together. Emma opened her eyes immediately. Her pulse quickened. Those noises did not belong to the weather. She reached for a notebook lying on the table and began writing. Northwest. Moving east. Intermittent metal contact. Multiple sources. She stared at the words. The logical part of her mind searched for explanations. Maybe fallen equipment carried by the wind. Maybe loose debris striking rocks. Maybe exhaustion creating patterns where none existed. She wanted to believe one of those explanations. Unfortunately, her instincts refused to cooperate. Half an hour passed. The sounds returned again. This time Emma noticed something new. Rhythm. The spacing between noises felt deliberate, organized, almost coordinated. She leaned closer to the window despite knowing she would see nothing beyond darkness and rain. Another faint sound reached her. Then another. Her stomach tightened. Those were not random impacts. They sounded like brief radio bursts carried by the wind. The signal was weak, fragmented, and distorted by weather conditions, but it existed. Emma immediately moved to the shelter's communications equipment. She adjusted settings and monitored frequencies. Static filled the speaker. Occasionally, a burst of interference broke through. Nothing useful, nothing clear. Yet the sensation persisted. Someone was out there. Several someones. At nearly the same moment, miles away, Captain Daniel Brooks and the rest of the team were sheltering inside a larger operations cabin near the extraction zone. Conditions had deteriorated throughout the night. Maps covered the main table. Portable lanterns cast long shadows against wooden walls. Most of the team focused on weather reports and route planning. Daniel, however, kept glancing toward the storm outside. He did not like leaving anyone behind, even temporarily. One of the team members noticed. "She is safe, Captain." Daniel nodded. "I know. The shelter is stocked. Communications are working intermittently. She will be fine until morning." Daniel looked back at the weather monitor. Probably. The answer sounded less confident than he intended. Back at the emergency shelter, Emma sat quietly and listened. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Then the most disturbing sound yet drifted through the storm. Voices. Not words. Just voices. Faint. Distant. Human. Emma froze. Every muscle in her body became still. The voices vanished almost immediately. She waited. Nothing. Then another brief fragment reached her. Human conversation carried across the landscape before disappearing into wind and rain. Emma slowly lowered the notebook. There was no longer any doubt in her mind. The mountain was not empty. Someone was moving through the storm. Someone who should not have been there. She looked toward the radio once more. The signal indicator flickered weakly. For several seconds, she hesitated. If she contacted Daniel now, what would she tell him? That she heard things nobody else could hear through a storm that was shaking entire mountains? The idea sounded ridiculous. Yet another faint burst of sound emerged from the darkness. This time Emma picked up the radio microphone without hesitation. Because whatever was happening beyond those rain-soaked ridges was getting closer with every passing hour. Emma pressed the transmit button and waited. Static filled the speaker. For a moment, she thought the signal had failed completely. Then a faint crackle answered. "Daniel, can you hear me?" she asked. The response arrived broken and distorted. "Emma, weak signal. Go ahead." Relief washed through her. At least the connection existed. She glanced toward the dark window as another burst of rain rattled against the shelter. "I need you to listen carefully," she said. "I think there are people moving through the valley northwest of my position." Silence followed. Not complete silence. The kind of silence that came when someone was trying to understand what they had just heard. Finally, Daniel answered. "People. Yes. Are you seeing them?" Emma hesitated. "No." Another pause. "Then how do you know they are there?" She looked down at the notebook covered with observations. Distances, directions, timing patterns, small details she had recorded over the past several hours. Explaining it out loud suddenly sounded impossible. "I can't hear them," she said. The radio remained silent for several seconds. In the operations cabin, Daniel exchanged a glance with two members of his team. One of them raised an eyebrow. The storm had been raging all night. Visibility was almost zero. The idea that someone could identify movement miles away through that weather seemed unlikely. "Emma," Daniel said carefully, "you have been alone for hours. You are injured. You are exhausted. The storm is producing all kinds of strange echoes." Emma expected that response. Part of her even understood it. Yet another distant sound drifted through the shelter. She immediately turned her head toward the northwest wall. 3 short metallic clicks. A pause. Then one longer sound. The pattern repeated. "There are at least 4 people," she said quietly. "Maybe more." "Based on what?" Daniel asked. "Movement patterns." One of the team members sitting beside him could not help smiling. "Movement patterns?" he whispered. Daniel motioned for him to stay quiet. Emma continued. "They are not wandering. They are traveling together. They keep stopping at regular intervals." The team member shook his head. "The storm is playing tricks on her." Another member nodded in agreement. Daniel did not respond immediately. He trusted Emma. She was intelligent, disciplined, and rarely dramatic. But this claim stretched credibility. "Try to get some rest," he told her. "We will reassess conditions at first light." Emma closed her eyes briefly. Frustration threatened to rise, but she pushed it away. Arguing would accomplish nothing. "All right," she said. "Just be careful." The transmission ended moments later. The shelter felt even quieter afterward. Outside, the storm continued without mercy. Emma returned to the window and listened. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Then the sounds returned. This time they were clearer. Not louder. Clearer. As if whatever was moving through the valley had entered a section where the terrain carried sound more efficiently. Emma grabbed the notebook again. She began sketching a rough map from memory. Every time she heard a metallic sound, she marked a location. Every time she detected what sounded like a voice or radio interference, she added another symbol. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Her pulse quickened. The movement was not random. The route appeared intentional. More disturbing still, it seemed to be heading toward the same region where Daniel's team planned to move once daylight arrived. Emma stared at the map. The realization settled heavily in her chest. If she was right, the storm was hiding more than rain and darkness. It was hiding people. And while nobody believed her warning yet, the sounds drifting through the mountains were becoming too consistent, too organized, and too deliberate to ignore. Emma barely noticed the passage of time. The storm erased all normal measurements of it. Minutes felt like hours. Hours disappeared in what seemed like moments. The only thing that remained constant were the sounds. They continued moving through the mountains with a consistency that made her increasingly uneasy. Every observation she added to the notebook strengthened the same conclusion. Whatever was out there was organized. Shortly before dawn, the rain began easing slightly. The wind remained strong, but the endless pounding against the shelter roof softened enough for Emma to isolate even more details. She sat at the table with a flashlight illuminating the rough map she had drawn by hand. Small marks covered the page. Arrows, notes, estimated directions, patterns. She listened, then added another mark. Listened again. Another mark. Gradually a route emerged across the paper. Her pulse quickened. The movement formed a corridor through the valley. Not random wandering. Not scattered activity. A route. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she needed to contact Daniel again. The problem was simple. She still lacked proof. All she had were sounds. Strange sounds heard through a storm by an injured woman sitting alone in a shelter. It sounded ridiculous. Yet every instinct told her otherwise. The radio suddenly crackled to life. Emma immediately reached for it. Daniel. Static filled the speaker before a reply emerged. Morning, Emma. Signal is a little better. Relief crossed her face. I need to tell you something. Go ahead. Emma looked down at the notebook. The movement I mentioned last night continued all night long. A pause followed. Daniel sounded patient but cautious. You are still hearing people? Yes. Another pause. Emma, daylight is coming. We should be able to verify conditions soon. She understood what he meant. He still was not convinced. Listen to me, she said quietly. I tracked the sounds. Tracked them. They followed a route through the Northwest Valley. On the other end of the transmission, Daniel glanced toward a topographic map spread across a table. Several team members listened nearby. One of them folded his arms. Another shook his head slightly. Daniel remained focused. What kind of route? Emma traced her finger across the notebook. Consistent movement. Repeated stops. Direction changes at predictable terrain features. Silence followed. Then one of Daniel's team members leaned closer to the radio microphone. Emma, with all respect, how can you know that? Emma looked toward the storm-dark window. Because they keep making the same mistakes. The cabin grew quiet. What mistakes? Daniel asked. Metal contact. Emma answered immediately. Equipment touching rock. Brief radio bursts. Movement patterns. They stop every time they enter exposed terrain. Then continue after a delay. The team exchanged confused looks. The explanation sounded oddly specific. Too specific. Daniel studied the map again. And where exactly do you think they are heading? Emma lowered her eyes to the page. The answer unsettled her. Toward the Eastern Ridge system. Nobody spoke for several seconds. That happened to be the same general area Daniel's team planned to cross after weather conditions improved. One team member finally laughed nervously. That is a pretty large area. Not anymore, Emma replied. Her voice remained calm. They narrowed their route around 2 hours ago. Daniel felt a strange sensation he could not explain. Emma was not guessing. She sounded certain. Completely certain. He looked toward the map again. Send me everything you have. Several heads turned toward him in surprise. One team member immediately objected. Captain, you cannot seriously be basing decisions on sounds from a storm. Daniel continued studying the map. No. He paused. But I know Emma. She does not invent problems. After ending the transmission, Emma carefully copied her notes into a cleaner diagram. As she worked, another faint sequence of sounds drifted through the mountains. This time she identified the location almost instantly. Her eyes widened. The pattern had changed. Whatever was moving through the valley was no longer approaching slowly. It was accelerating. And for the first time since the storm began, Emma felt genuinely afraid that she might already be running out of time. Captain Daniel Brooks spent the next hour comparing Emma's notes against every map and terrain survey available inside the operations cabin. At first, he approached the task simply to reassure himself that he had considered every possibility. The weather was improving slowly. Visibility remained poor, but daylight had begun pushing back the darkness. One by one, details from Emma's observations were placed onto the map. Distances, timing, direction changes, estimated pauses. The more he studied them, the more uncomfortable he became. Several of the locations she identified matched natural movement corridors through the valley. More surprisingly, the stopping points she described corresponded with sheltered areas that travelers would logically use during severe weather. That could be coincidence, one team member argued. Daniel wanted to agree. Unfortunately, the pattern continued. Every new comparison seemed to support Emma's conclusions rather than weaken them. He finally spread a larger topographic chart across the table and traced the route she had described. The room gradually grew quieter. One of the specialists leaned forward. "Hold on." Daniel looked up. "What?" The specialist pointed to the map. "If her timing estimates are accurate, then the movement path narrows right here." His finger rested on a ridgeline east of their position. Daniel stared at it. The location happened to be the same area Emma had warned about during their last transmission. Another team member folded his arms. "We still do not know what she is hearing." "No," Daniel said, "but she keeps identifying the same place." Outside, the storm continued to weaken. Low clouds still covered the mountains, but visibility had improved enough for limited reconnaissance. Daniel made a decision. "We are going to verify it." Several heads turned immediately. "You believe her?" someone asked. Daniel paused before answering. "I believe she believes what she is hearing. That is enough for me to check." Within 30 minutes, a small observation team moved toward the ridge. Back at the emergency shelter, Emma sat beside the radio listening to the mountains. The sounds had changed again. The movement no longer felt distant. She could isolate individual sources more easily now. A brief metallic click emerged from the northwest. Several minutes later, another followed. Then came a faint burst of radio interference. Emma marked each one carefully. Her notebook was nearly full. Despite the fatigue pulling at her body, she remained focused. Something told her the next few hours would matter. The radio suddenly crackled. "Emma, this is Daniel." She grabbed the microphone immediately. "Go ahead. We are approaching the ridge." Emma closed her eyes and listened. Wind, trees, rain. Then a faint sound she recognized instantly. "Slow down." Daniel frowned. "Why?" "You were getting close." Silence followed. "Close to what?" Emma listened again. The sound came from farther east than before. "The route shifted overnight," she said. "About 400 yards north of your current position." Several members of Daniel's team exchanged skeptical looks. Yet he wrote down the information anyway. Minutes later, the observation team reached a vantage point overlooking the valley. Binoculars scanned the terrain below. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then one of the observers stiffened. "Captain." Daniel stepped closer. "What do you have?" The observer pointed toward a distant section of tree cover. Through a break in the clouds, subtle movement became visible. Not one source. Several. Organized. Following a route through the valley almost exactly where Emma had predicted. The observer lowered the binoculars slowly. How did she know that? Nobody answered. Daniel simply stared across the landscape. Every major detail Emma had provided matched reality. The direction, the timing, the route. Even the location change she had reported minutes earlier. Back at the shelter, Emma sat quietly beside the radio. She did not know what the team was seeing. She only knew the sounds were still there. Then the radio crackled again. This time Daniel's voice sounded very different. There was no skepticism left in it. Only disbelief. "Emma," he said slowly, "tell me everything you hear. Every single detail." Emma tightened her grip on the radio microphone. For the first time since the storm began, nobody questioned what she was hearing. Nobody suggested fatigue. Nobody blamed the weather. Captain Daniel Brooks and his team had seen enough with their own eyes to understand that something unusual was happening. "All right," Daniel said through the radio. "Start from the beginning. Every detail matters." Emma looked down at the notebooks spread across the table. Pages were filled with arrows, timing estimates, and observations gathered throughout the night. She took a slow breath and listened again before speaking. "The movement pattern changed around 3 hours ago," she said. "They stopped using the lower valley and shifted toward higher ground. Daniel immediately relayed the information to the observation team positioned along the ridge. Several minutes later, confirmation came back. The route matched exactly. One of the observers lowered his binoculars and stared toward the radio in disbelief, as if he could somehow see Emma through it. Back at the shelter, Emma continued listening. The storm had weakened enough that she could isolate sounds more clearly than before. She heard water flowing through narrow channels, wind crossing rocky ledges, tree branches scraping together. Beneath those natural sounds, she identified something else. A sequence of brief metallic contacts. Not random, not accidental, repeating at irregular but recognizable intervals. She marked another location on the map. They stopped again, she said. Daniel glanced toward the ridge team. Can you verify? A pause followed. Then the response came back. Confirmed. The cabin fell silent. One of the team members slowly sat down. Another stared at the map without speaking. Emma's predictions were no longer merely accurate. They were becoming precise. Nearly an hour passed this way. Emma listened. Daniel compared her observations against reports from the field. Again and again the information aligned. Every update strengthened the same impossible conclusion. Somehow, from an isolated shelter miles away, an injured woman was tracking movement across an entire valley more effectively than trained observers equipped with optics and direct visibility. Eventually, one of the younger team members spoke quietly. How is she doing this? Nobody answered. Daniel looked toward the storm-dark mountains outside the cabin window. The same question had been growing in his mind all morning. He remembered conversations from years earlier, mentions of specialized programs, experimental reconnaissance techniques, stories that sounded exaggerated enough to ignore. Suddenly those stories felt much more real. Back at the shelter, Emma's concentration broke briefly when another sharp sound reached her. Different from the others. She immediately straightened in her chair. Daniel, go ahead. Something changed. His voice became serious. What do you hear? Emma closed her eyes. The sound repeated. Then came another from a different direction. Her pulse quickened. There are more of them than I thought. Silence followed. How many? Daniel asked. I do not know. Emma listened carefully. But there are at least 2 separate groups now. The observation team quickly began checking surrounding terrain. Minutes later, another report arrived. Additional movement had been identified beyond the first route. The operations cabin erupted with activity. Maps were repositioned. Locations were marked. New observation points were assigned. Through it all, Daniel remained focused on one thing. Emma had identified the change before anyone else. One of the specialists finally shook his head in amazement. She is hearing things from miles away through a storm. Daniel looked down at Emma's handwritten map. Every line told the same story. Every mark represented information nobody should have been able to gather under those conditions. Yet there it was. Real. Verifiable. Impossible to dismiss. As afternoon approached and the last remnants of the storm drifted beyond the mountains, the atmosphere inside the operations cabin changed completely. Skepticism vanished. Doubt disappeared. What remained was respect mixed with curiosity, because everyone now understood that Emma Hayes possessed an ability far beyond ordinary perception. The only question left was how. And somewhere deep inside military archives and forgotten records, the answer had been waiting for years. The answer began surfacing later that afternoon. While observation teams continued monitoring the valley, Captain Daniel Brooks returned to the operations cabin and requested access to archived personnel records. At first, he searched for recent assignments connected to Emma Hayes. Nothing unusual appeared. Medical certifications, rescue training, communications experience. The file looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Daniel frowned and continued digging. One note buried deep within an older section caught his attention. The reference was brief. Most of the details had been restricted years earlier. Yet a single phrase remained visible. Special Acoustic Reconnaissance Program. Daniel stared at the screen. He had heard rumors about the program early in his career. Most people assumed it had been experimental. A small initiative designed to identify individuals with extraordinary auditory perception and train them for specialized observation work. The stories rarely appeared in official discussions and eventually faded into military folklore. Daniel opened another record. Then another. The pieces slowly began fitting together. Across the room, several team members watched his expression change. What did you find? One asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. He scrolled through another page and finally leaned back in his chair. I think I know why she can do this. The room grew quiet. Meanwhile, Emma remained inside the emergency shelter. The storm had nearly passed. Occasional gusts still swept through the mountains, but daylight now reached the valley clearly. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, she could actually see portions of the landscape she had been tracking entirely through sound. The experience felt strange. Familiar landmarks appeared exactly where she had imagined them. Ridges, tree lines, drainage channels. The geography matched the mental map she had built during the night. Yet Emma paid little attention to her surroundings. She was listening again. The sounds had become weaker as distance increased, but they remained detectable. More importantly, they were predictable. She knew where they would appear before they happened. The realization brought back memories she had spent years trying to forget. Training facilities, sound laboratories, endless exercises conducted in controlled environments. Instructors testing limits few people believed existed. Back then, her unusual hearing had earned her a nickname. Most recruits laughed when they first heard it. Later they stopped laughing. The radio suddenly crackled. Emma. She recognized Daniel's voice immediately. Go ahead. A brief pause followed. You never told us about the program. Emma closed her eyes. For several seconds, she said nothing. Daniel continued. Special acoustic reconnaissance. Silence lingered between them. Then Emma smiled faintly. I wondered how long it would take. Several people inside the operations cabin exchanged looks. One team member leaned closer to hear the conversation. Daniel looked down at the personnel file. Ghost ear, he asked. Emma laughed softly for the first time since the storm began. That nickname was supposed to stay buried. Apparently not. Another pause followed. The atmosphere felt different now. Not mysterious. Not uncertain. The impossible finally had a name. Daniel studied the records again. Years of specialized training. Advanced observation certifications. Evaluations unlike anything he had seen before. Suddenly, every strange report from the previous 24 hours made perfect sense. You could have told us, he said. Emma looked toward the mountains beyond the shelter window. Nobody ever asked. The simplicity of the answer left the room silent. She had never hidden her abilities. She had simply stopped talking about them. Over time, people assumed she was ordinary. Eventually, even she preferred it that way. Daniel smiled despite himself. Well, the entire team is asking now. Emma glanced at the notebook filled with observations gathered through the storm. Then I suppose they finally have their answer. And as word spread through the operation, disbelief slowly transformed into admiration. The woman everyone thought needed rescuing had quietly become the most valuable source of information in the mountains. By late afternoon, the mountains looked almost unrecognizable. The storm that had dominated the landscape for more than a day had finally moved beyond the horizon, leaving behind clear skies, cool air, and sunlight that spilled across the ridges in long bands of gold. Captain Daniel Brooks stood beside a transport vehicle as it climbed the final stretch of trail toward the emergency shelter. Around him, members of the team were unusually quiet. Some were tired. Some were relieved. Most were still trying to process everything they had learned. For nearly 24 hours, they had believed Emma Hayes was the one who needed rescuing. Now they understood how incomplete that assumption had been. When the shelter finally came into view, Daniel spotted Emma standing outside near the doorway. She leaned slightly on a support rail, her injuries still slowing her movements, but otherwise she looked remarkably calm. The same notebook rested beneath her arm. The same notebook that had changed the entire operation. As the vehicle stopped, several team members climbed out first. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the younger specialists smiled and shook his head. I still cannot believe it. Emma raised an eyebrow. Believe what? The specialist laughed softly. That you spent all night listening to things the rest of us could not even detect. Another team member added. And somehow you were more accurate than people looking directly at the valley. Emma looked down at the notebook. The mountains tell you a lot if you pay attention. The answer sounded simple. Almost too simple. Yet nobody laughed. Not anymore. Daniel walked toward her carrying a folder. I brought something. Emma accepted it and opened the cover. Inside were copies of several archived records from the old reconnaissance program. Training evaluations. Certifications. Notes from instructors. Documents she had not seen in years. She stared at them quietly. Where did you find these? Deep inside a database that apparently nobody looks at anymore, Daniel replied. Emma smiled faintly. Probably for the best. Daniel studied her for a moment. You know, when we left you here, I thought we were leaving behind an injured team member who needed help. Emma closed the folder. That seems reasonable. Daniel shook his head. No. What actually happened is that we left behind the most valuable observer in the entire operation. Several team members nodded immediately. One of them added, You probably saved us from making some very bad decisions. Emma looked toward the mountains stretching across the distance. Sunlight reflected from wet rocks and lingering patches of fog. Everything felt peaceful now, almost impossible compared to the chaos of the previous night. I was just listening, she said quietly. Daniel smiled. Most people listen. He glanced toward the valley below. Very few people truly hear. The ride back to base felt different from the journey that had brought them into the mountains. Conversations were warmer. Questions were endless. Team members wanted to know about the old program, the training, the techniques, and the stories behind the nickname that had survived for years inside forgotten files. Emma answered some questions, avoided others, but for the first time in a long while, she did not seem bothered that people knew the truth. As the vehicle disappeared down the mountain road and the last traces of the storm faded into memory, one lesson remained with everyone who had witnessed the events. Extraordinary abilities do not always arrive with recognition. They do not always announce themselves through titles or reputation. Sometimes they sit quietly in the background, overlooked until the exact moment they are needed. And sometimes the person everyone worries about becomes the very person who guides everyone else through the darkness.